Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I fully understand that my decision to host Professor Jeffrey Sachs on The Focus may be seen as controversial, but let me be clear. I've always supported the transatlantic alliance and continue to do so. I do not believe in the cunning and evil deep American state conspiracy narrative that seems to be popular in some circles. I respect Sachs's intellect and his long experience in and among the world's elite. But I do not subscribe to his view of Putin being the wronged party in the Ukraine war. However, I also believe that our audience deserves the opportunity to hear different perspectives and come to their own conclusions. As a commentator for the past 24 years, I have been critical of US strategic and foreign policy when it has gone off the rails, particularly regarding the nation-building project in Afghanistan, the 2003 Iraq War, and yes, I have been a vocal critic of AUKUS Pillar 1. However, despite America's flaws, history shows that over the past 80 years, global stability and economic prosperity have, to a large extent, benefited from US leadership. The world under American hegemony has been far from perfect, but it has, on balance, provided structure to the international system. Yet we now live in a time when politics is no longer about seeking common ground. The battlefield of social media drowns out the center, favoring polarized extremes. The Focus will, from time to time, bring in perspectives from one side of the polarized argument and push back where possible, ultimately allowing our audience to decide where they stand, which is perfectly reasonable to expect on any democratic centrist platform. Unfortunately, my discussion with Professor Sachs was shorter than I had hoped, and due to time constraints, several important questions were left unasked. If you think it's worth inviting him back for a follow-up to address these, let us know in the comments. If the interest is there, I'll see what our magician, producer Malcolm Hughes, can make happen. In the meantime, stay engaged, stay critical, and as always, thank you for listening to The Focus. Hello and welcome back to The Focus. Jeffrey D. Sachs is a world-renowned economist, author, and public policy expert specializing in sustainable development, economic crises, and global diplomacy. He is a university professor at Columbia University and director of the Center for Sustainable Development. Sachs has served as a senior UN advisor, playing a key role in shaping the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. A best-selling author, Professor Sachs has written extensively on global economics, development, and geopolitics, with notable works such as The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, and The Ages of Globalization. His views on international affairs, including US foreign policy, NATO expansion, and the Ukraine war, have sparked both praise and controversy, making him one of the most debated public intellectuals today. In this episode of The Focus, we speak to Professor Sachs on his views regarding Russia, Ukraine, and the shifting global order. Jeffrey, welcome to The Focus.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Jeffrey, you're a political economist by trade, and according to many in the know, one of the best in the world. How and why did you get involved in the thorny issue of geopolitics, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, when one is involved with the international economy, and economic development, you can't stay away from geopolitics. Geopolitics, domestic politics, international markets, and domestic markets are all completely intertwined in any country. You can't think about the US or Australia or any country in Africa today, or Ukraine or Russia, without considering both the economics and the geopolitics. And so as I come at this as an economist, I have advised governments all over the world, dozens and dozens of heads of state and governments on particular issues. But in the case of Russia and Ukraine, I go back to the late 1980s when I was really, in fact, somewhat for accidental reasons, maybe the main outside advisor in the Central and Eastern European countries starting in 1989 in their transformation from the Soviet period to the democratization and market reform period, and then to eventual membership in the European Union. And that was in 1989 that I played a pretty central role in Poland's transformation and in several other countries in the region because of that. I was asked in 1990 to become an economic advisor to the team of economists advising President Mikhail Gorbachev. And so I became quite involved in the discussions of the Soviet reforms at the end of the Soviet period. Then when Gorbachev lost power and Yeltsin came to power, I was asked by President Yeltsin's economic team to advise President Yeltsin. I sat in the Kremlin in December 1991 with Boris Yeltsin immediately across from me to hear President Yeltsin say, "I announce the end of the Soviet Union," because it had just happened in a meeting in the next room that preceded the meeting that I and a group of economists was to have with President Yeltsin. So I heard that directly. I became an advisor to the second president of independent Ukraine, President Leonid Kuchma, in 1993-94. All of this is to say my firsthand experience in this region goes back now 36 years of pretty intense experience. And then in one way or another, I remained involved in the debates and the discussions of politics, geopolitics, economics throughout the years. When the Maidan coup occurred in February 2014, or the Maidan Revolution, depending on whose narrative you follow. But in any event, when that occurred, I was called almost immediately by the new Ukrainian government, by the prime minister, to come meet with him to talk about the economic crisis. So I was in Ukraine just after the Maidan, and I heard an earful about what had happened, how it had happened. I saw with my own eyes. I was invited to Ukraine in 2019 to meet with the new president, Mr. Zelensky. So I was at the lunch table with him and a delegation. I spoke to U.S. leaders in 2021, urging them to avoid the dramatic escalation that came with Russia's invasion in February 24, 2022. And I gave them good advice on how to avoid that war, and they rejected my advice. I advised the governments to settle quickly in the early months of 2022 in what became known as the Istanbul process, because Ukraine and Russia actually negotiated with Turkish mediators in Istanbul in March and April. The United States stopped those negotiations, shockingly. Probably 1 million Ukrainians have died or been wounded since the U.S. told the Ukrainians, "You don't have to do that. Keep fighting. You're on our side. You don't have to declare neutrality," which was the core of the agreement that they were about to sign in April 2022. So when you ask, how do I get involved? Well, I am an economist. I'm a specialist on budgets, monetary policy, fiscal policy, debt management, issues like that. But in that process, you advise governments, you observe politics, you have to be involved in negotiating international agreements, say with the IMF or the World Bank, or debt restructuring agreements. Boy, that's politics. So there's no sharp dividing line between those.
Well, it's funny you should say that. And I think that from my many years here operating in a sort of semi-political role here in Australia, trying to get people to understand the unification of hard security, politics, and economics has always been what do we say? A bit noir. No one listens to me. It's like, no, no, they're all different. They're all separate, you know. But anyway, that's
Well,
that's
let
that's a
me
discussion.
officially say to your listeners, listen,
Yeah. Oh,
because
thank you, thank you.
this is exactly right. These are all interconnected.
Yeah.
So many games, by the way, so much maneuvering.
Mm,
Uh, who gets to trade? What principles? Who gets the loans? Who doesn't get the loans? Which companies come in? This is politics. It's not just markets and uh,
mm,
perfect competition, as one would hear in a first year economics textbook. This is
mm.
a pretty interlocked political, geopolitical, and economic system.
Oh, absolutely. Critics in the Atlanticist security community, however, argue that you and John Mearsheimer echo Putin's justifications for Russia's actions, often placing the blame on the US and NATO. As an American, what led you to this position? I mean, you gave an indication earlier, but you know, I think for people who are in our audience who may have not heard your position, they probably would like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, first of all, that charge is correct in one sense. I think that uh, the way that the Russians explain this crisis is more accurate than the way that the Americans explain this crisis, just straight out. Of course, there are games of narrative, but I come from a country that lies for a living. The governments lie for a living. All my life, the United States government has lied. It lied about Vietnam. It lied about Iraq. It lied about Syria. It lied about countless things. And one of the things it's lied about is its behavior vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Russia from 1990 onward. I've seen it with my own eyes. So there's a difference between uh, agreeing with something that President Putin says and being an apologist or being in his pocket or being on his pay. I'm not on anybody's pay, believe me. This has nothing to do with some kind of ulterior interest. Uh, I depend for my livelihood on being as accurate as possible. Let me put it that way. My words come back to be quoted to me 20 years later, 30 years later. So I'm very careful about what I say, why I say it, what the evidence is, and so forth. This is not a game. It's not a business. It happens that I believe that the Russian uh, position on this is more accurate. Now, here's the story. The story is that when I worked for Gorbachev, I actually believed that the Western world should help President Gorbachev to stabilize and transform the Soviet economy, which was a failure as an economy, and it needed to become a mixed market economy. And it was also in a deep financial crisis. And I have expertise in designing ways out of financial crises. That was my specialty for years and years with a lot of successes. And I recommended that the U.S. help. And the answer from the U.S. government was, hell no, we're not going to help them. They're the enemies. I said, Gorbachev's not the enemy. A soft landing, a help with transformation will be good for world peace. They were not interested in that. They were interested in U.S. dominance, in U.S. primacy, in the U.S. becoming the most powerful country in the world. The view from the Russian side or the Soviet side is the Cold War is over. Let's become normal and have good relations. The view from the American side was we won, you lost, we run the show. Basically, it's as simple as that. And it's true, it's as simple as that. And I lived through that for 35 years. American arrogance, America as the indispensable country, America as the only country that counts, America that doesn't have to listen to a word of Russian concerns, and so on. Well, there's a lot to say, and I could spend hours with you on what happened, but basically, three things happened. When the Soviet Union was ending, the United States promised no NATO enlargement. This was February 7th, 1990. Explicit. It happened to be repeated countless times, by the way. But the idea was that the United States and Germany said, let us end World War II with German reunification, and we, the West, will not take advantage view the Soviet Union as Germany reunifies and as you, President Gorbachev, end the Warsaw Pact military alliance. Essentially, the US cheated on that as soon as it could. So the basic story from 1991 onward is, oh, Soviet Union lost, now we do what we want, including NATO enlargement. And not just NATO enlargement to Central Europe, to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, but all the way to Ukraine. And by the way, not all the way to Ukraine only, but all the way to Georgia. People should take out a map and look at Georgia. NATO, the North Atlantic Defense Organization in Georgia, in the Southern Caucasus. Are you kidding? But of course, the idea was from 1991 onward that the United States would dominate. Dominate. Many words given for that. Liberal hegemony, primacy, full spectrum dominance, indispensable country, world leader, whatever you want. Such arrogance for a country of 4.1% of the world population. Now, I have to say, since we're all Anglo-Saxons here, you know, everything the United States learned, they learned from the British. The British actually are the most arrogant, it's the most arrogant country in the whole world in modern history. And the US took that on, the baton from Churchill to Truman in 1945, and that was the view. But from 45 to 91, there was the pesky fact of the Soviet Union. Starting after 1991, to the American eyes, as far as the eye could see, no conceivable rival. China, by the way, was not on anybody's radar screen. It was a bunch of rice-growing villages as far as the Americans were concerned. It was nowhere to be seen. Russia was a gas station with nuclear weapons, as the quip, so-called quip, went in the 1990s and the 2000s. So the US was so full of itself. Now, that meant three kinds of foreign policies that I think are really important to understand very briefly. One was NATO enlargement. If anybody played the board game Risk, you want your piece on every piece of the board. And that's what the US wanted for 30 years with its military, a base every place on the board. It wants it in Australia. It wants nuclear submarines in Australia. What, for God's sake? Are we kidding? It wants it everywhere around the Chinese Rim. It wants it in Central Asia. It wants it in Africa. It wants it in the Middle East, and so on and so on and so on. So number one was put your military piece on every part of the board, including NATO enlargement, contrary to promise. Second was regime change. American foreign policy is based on a simple idea, unique of all statecraft in the world to the United States, which is if you don't like your counterpart, change their government. You know, most other countries can't do this. If Australia says we don't like New Zealand, you don't change the government, or we don't like the way the Japanese are, you don't change the government. You have to do diplomacy somehow. You have to engage. You have to figure out how to maneuver. But the United States view is you don't like the government, change it. And we do covert regime change operations for a living, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And I've seen them with my own eyes. Presidents carried away by the CIA, by the way, coups, color revolutions. Anyway, that's the second. The third was to abandon the nuclear arms control framework, probably the least discussed and most consequential of all. In 2002, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. I think this was the single most destabilizing event in 30 years between the US and Russia. All of a sudden, the US is putting anti-ballistic missile systems in Eastern and Central Europe. And the Russians are saying, oh, that's nice. What are in those silos? Nuclear weapons? Well, maybe not. Decapitation strike? Who knows? But they're coming closer and closer to Moscow, and there's a real possibility that they'll be in Ukraine as soon as we know it. So these were the three features of US arrogance: NATO enlargement and similar enlargement of military bases of the United States in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, the first island chain and all the rest. That's number one. Number two, regime change operations. And number three, breaking the nuclear stability. By the way, in 2017, Trump walked out of another nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action vis-a-vis Iran. In 2019, he walked out of another nuclear agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. This is very little talked about, but it weighs extremely heavily in geopolitics because nuclear arms between the two nuclear superpowers with the biggest arsenals matters profoundly. And this destabilized the relations, and many events happened. But to my mind, the US kept cheating and cheating because it was so damn arrogant as the Russians kept saying, stop already, stop already, stop the NATO enlargement, stop the regime change operations, go back to nuclear arms control. The US was not interested at all. In my view, from what I saw with my own eyes, the US played an active role in a coup in February 2014, overthrowing the Yanukovych government. In my eyes, from my direct experience, the US played an active role in torpedoing the Minsk II agreement, which was a way to have peace in Ukraine, not based on Ukraine losing its eastern Ukrainian oblasts to Russia, but rather on autonomy for those ethnically Russian regions. The US didn't like that political autonomy. To my view, the US torpedoed the Istanbul-based peace agreements of March and April 2022. I couldn't stand what the Biden administration was doing. This is another point I'd like to emphasize. I was a lifelong Democratic Party voter in the United States. I'm out of that now because not only did the Democrats become warmongers, but this is not about parties. This is not about partisanship. This is about lousy foreign policy that was sustained over 30 years. And I'll just say, vis-a-vis Australia and East Asia, the United States has the propensity to create the same disaster vis-a-vis China if we're not careful. I'm hoping they won't be so stupid and they will have learned something, but Taiwan could be the Ukraine of East Asia, the same way that Ukraine became the Afghanistan of Europe. In other words, a kind of battleground in which the US battles its foes, destroys the battleground country, and creates a global crisis.
You know, Jeffrey, just listening to all of that, I mean, I appreciate the length of your service and I appreciate everything that you've said because your experience really does come through and it does color what you perceive of as the world. But when you look at it from a more objective standpoint and you look at it from, say, a realist standpoint, one could argue quite strongly, I would imagine, so what? The Americans dominate. So what? That is international power. Name me one international power in history that never stood up for its own national interest. Name me one no, before the Americans, as you rightly point out, there were the Brits. Before the Brits, there were the Romans. You can go back centuries and see all this pattern play out. Why are we surprised that the Americans act the way they act? And also, there's the other side of the coin, which I really want you to address, and that is, you know, the Russians or the Soviet state as it collapsed was probably not a sure bet to bet on for anyone in Washington at the time. I mean, it was a collapsing, failing entity. And as a collapsing, failing entity, and with Gorbachev himself having been arrested by his own fellow Soviets at one point in a coup, surely that sort of deep level of instability. Oh, I don't know what happened there.
I don't
Someone must be
either.
listening. Someone must be listening in.
Yeah, okay. I hope a lot of people are listening, but anyway.
Yes, well, yeah, the right type of people, not those
Right.
type of people, right?
But just to say,
Yeah.
oh my God.
Well,
Oh
we're talking
yes.
about
First,
realism
yeah.
and stuff.
Let me mention two things. First,
Yeah.
our leading realist, international relations specialist, John Mearsheimer,
Yeah.
not only do he and I totally agree. He's been saying this so clearly, vividly, and correctly, and powerfully since 2014 that we're completely aligned. So this is not about realism versus not realism. John Mearsheimer thought this was a losing proposition, that the United States would end up wrecking Ukraine. He said in 2015, we are leading Ukraine down the primrose path. Ukraine will be destroyed by this. And the reason he and I feel this way is that for the United States, this is a great power game, as you described it. For Russia, this is an existential threat. Now, if you take two superpowers, and for one it's a game, and the other it's an existential threat, how's that going to come out in the end? The one that regards it as an existential threat is going to prevail in the end. And the reason is something that Barack Obama rightly said in 2015 when he didn't want to get more deeply into this. He said Russia has escalatory dominance. What he meant by that is that if Russia's losing conventionally, it's going to up the ante to tactical nukes. And if that doesn't work, it's going to up the ante again. We're not going to do that because this is not at all central to American security. Even Trump, in his Trumpian way, we got a big ocean between. So the US was playing a game. It was playing a great power game. Russia was defending its core national security interests of not having the United States up against its border, missile systems up against its border, the CIA all over Ukraine, as, by the way, a recent interesting New York Times article detailed it, to be there to destabilize Russia. They don't want that. It's obvious. So what do I think? You have a country like Russia. It's got 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. It's a sophisticated, powerful country. A war between the US and Russia, a nuclear war could end humanity and the world. What do you do in that case? You listen to the red lines of each side. You don't let the Russians or the Soviets put a military base in Cuba, and you don't put a military base in Ukraine. You give enough space so that we don't end the world. So that's realism to me. It is, yes, it's not playing a game. It's actually being deadly serious because this is not a game. And I came to understand, by the way, over the years, we teach game theory, we learn game theory, we speak in terms of game theory, tactics, strategy, deterrence, bluff, this and that. They treat it like a game. They actually treat it like a video game.
Look, I take your point, but of course, game theory is also very, very prevalent in the world of economics. And
Yep.
it isn't just a zero sum. I think that many people misunderstand what game theory is all about because, I mean, having studied in my
Yep.
youth nuclear war, we all understand that there is this sort of creation, this architecture of, this guy does that, that guy does that, there's a risk and there's a reward. But there is also many other forms of game theory that can also explain other things, cooperation,
Oh, I
collaboration.
agree. No, I'm not
And
arguing with that. But
yeah.
one of the ways you get cooperation is you talk to the other side. One of the profound failings of the last 25, 30 years is the lack of diplomacy. Biden did not speak with Putin from January 2022 till the end of his administration in January 2025. Now, Biden may not have been compos mentis, by the way. We don't really know, and it's quite possible that he wasn't for a couple of the years. But the fact of the matter is there was no diplomacy, not even at the level of foreign ministers. That's shambolic, if I can use that word. That's a shame. That's ridiculous. One of the things that experimental game theory teaches is if you talk to the other side, you're much more likely to find the cooperative outcome than if you don't have communication with the other side. So this is my point is it's not good enough to say, well, great powers always behave this way. We're courting disaster, and we shouldn't be courting disaster. There's no reason to court disaster.
Jeffrey, if I may,
Yeah.
was there no other way that Putin could have played this to his advantage? I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that Russia has, God knows how many nuclear weapons. It has got hard power. But the thing that, from my perspective in particular, having looked at this, I'm always drawn by the fact is you could have achieved all the aims of pushing back American power in a non-confrontational, non-threatening manner. Why did you do this? You know what the enemy is. The Russians know the Americans. They know the patterns of behavior. They know this because they have been, as according to you, bitten so many times by American arrogance and power. So
Yeah.
then if they know all of this, and if they're so smart and Putin's such a great strategist, why
He is,
then did
by the
he
way.
why did he launch the invasion? Why did he
Well,
threaten
again,
Eastern Europe?
well, he didn't actually threaten Eastern Europe, but
But
why did he?
his
No,
behavior.
no, I don't think so. Again, I think that it's very important to look at what they do and what is said. I believe that the purpose of the operation on February 24th, 2022, that Russia called a special military operation, was to bring Ukraine to its senses to declare neutrality. It was not to take over Ukraine. It was not for a long war. It was actually to force Ukraine to the negotiating table. It worked within 2 weeks. Then the United States said, no, no, we'll have a long war. This is what happened. Uh, One can go back. The Russians tried and tried and tried, and we could spend hours on this. And many, many people know this story uh, from the diplomats and so on. In 2007, Putin said at the Munich Security Conference, do not expand to Ukraine. What does the United States do the next year? NATO must expand to Ukraine at the Bucharest NATO summit. Very, very typical. In 2011, two regime change operations, one of Syria and one of CIA operation, one of Libya, both the Russian allies. 2014, U.S. active participation in a coup against a neutral government in Ukraine. Minsk Agreement in 2015, endorsed by the UN Security Council, guaranteed by France and Germany. What does the U.S. do? Blow it out of the water. 2019, U.S. unilaterally walks out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. 2021, Putin puts on the table a draft security agreement between Russia and the United States, December 15th, 2021. I called the White House soon afterwards and begged with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, take the negotiation. You got something to avoid the war. He said to me, don't worry, Jeff, there'll be no war. That was the American position in December 2021. I said, Jake, just say NATO's not going to enlarge and you'll avoid the war. No, no, we can't say that. Then the special military operation was designed, it's a small number of people, by the way. It was not designed to take over Ukraine or to have a prolonged war. It was designed to bring Zelensky to the negotiating table. It did that. Within 3 weeks, Zelensky was publicly saying, we'll be neutral, we can reach an agreement. Papers were exchanged. On March 29th, 2022, there's a joint Ukrainian-Russian communique explaining the outlines of peace, a communique. And then on April 15th, 2022, there's a draft agreement about to be signed. The United States stopped it. And famously, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and so forth. So this is not folding out of some wild aggression by Putin. This was trying to find a way not to have a war repeatedly. And it was trying to find a way to close negotiations repeatedly. I'll tell you what the Americans thought. The Americans thought we're going to cut them out of SWIFT. They actually called that the nuclear option, if you can imagine, the nuclear economic option. Stupid, by the way. They thought, okay, this is going to end the Russian economy. I can't tell you the incompetence repeatedly. This is not geniuses playing sophisticated games. This is incompetence. They thought that the HIMARS missile systems would do it. They thought that the ATACMS missile systems would do it. They thought that Putin wouldn't mobilize if this went on for 3 or 4 months. They thought he would be destabilized. They thought everything. It's interesting, there's an old line that the Russians play chess and the Americans play poker. This was a poker game. The Americans were bluffing all the way. Weak-hand, ignored the Obama main point, which is for Russia, this is the real thing. For America, this is a game. And so this was not some design by Putin. Why didn't he do less? He did from 2007 to 2022 trying to avoid this war. That's the truth, actually. Of course, it's completely the opposite of our narrative, but our narrative ain't worth, I won't say it, but it is just nonsense. If you've watched this and lived through this and understand this, this is American arrogance, by the way. And honestly, and they want to test their weapon systems. Why is the U.S. drawing Australia into a conflict like this? Is this really necessary for Australia to break the bank to buy nuclear submarines, for heaven's sake? This is ridiculous. This is an American.
That's a long story.
I know it is.
I spend many hours telling you why.
I know it is.
But
of course you shouldn't. Of course you shouldn't. And it's the same thing in Ukraine. That's my basic point.
Considering all the things that you've said up to now, what do you think of the Trump White House? Obviously, the so-called bad old days of America acting arrogantly is changing, or at least
Well, there's still a lot of arrogance, that's for sure.
Well, the Trump administration is obviously showing a much more positive face to Putin. So I'm curious what your take on this is. Do you think that, with people like Tulsi Gabbard and various other people, J.D. Vance maybe, that these guys are going to be profoundly changing America's relation with Russia, with the idea that they're going to somehow strike a deal, not only for Ukraine, but as sort of a final deal on conventional war across Europe? I mean, is this even possible? And can
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Please unpack.
No, I think to be just a shorthand, Trump doesn't want to have a conflict with Russia because he doesn't see it as a fundamental issue. Russia's not going to invade Europe. Europe should have its own defense system. I don't know whether NATO will last another 10 years or not. NATO could have been ended in 1990, and it could end sometime in the next 10 years. I'm in favor of Europe building up its own autonomous defense system, not for war with Russia, that would be suicide, but just for deterrence and to have an autonomy of foreign policy. So I think that that's going to change. I don't think it's so easy to say that in the Middle East, and I don't think it's so easy to say that in East Asia. So there are several areas of American conflict or potential conflict, and there's much less clarity in these other areas whether there will be a change of foreign policy or not. So I think we're still in early days. There are a lot of China hardliners in the administration. That is almost a consensus in Washington. I disagree with the consensus. I think it's absolutely, again, totally avoidable any kind of conflict, and a conflict would be horrendous and should be avoided, certainly. In the Middle East, I think America is dominated by the Israel lobby and led to reckless and useless wars. And we're not over that yet, apparently. Foreign policy is still in its formative stages. But when it comes to Ukraine, I think the Ukraine war is going to end soon.
Okay, just one final question, if I may. Given the documented war crimes committed by Russian forces, targeting civilians, summary executions, torture, rape, forced deportations, and the use of prohibited weapons, how can there be a stable and just peace in Ukraine without an internationally recognized or enforced restitution for these crimes? If Trump absolved Putin of any accountability, what does that signal to the world about the future of war crimes prosecutions and international law? And obviously, when we talk about this, if we had the time, we could also rope in what you thought about Netanyahu's war in Gaza and how that also plays out. But because you're on a time limit, we can't go down that, but hopefully we'll be able to get you back and talk about that at some future date.
Well, if there was a serious war crimes enforcement, just about every modern American president would be in the dock. That's all. We play a game pointing fingers, but we don't look at ourselves. And we need to look at ourselves. All the war crimes that America has committed over the years with impunity, with the millions dead, with the scorched earth, with Laos and Cambodia still a carpet of landmines. Come on, this is, and with a real genocide underway in Gaza right now, this kind of talk doesn't really move me because it's not based on objective standards. It's based on that the other side is evil and we're good. And that is not the right starting point for this kind of discussion.
Okay, Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much for sharing your insights on The Focus.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
From New York in the US, that was Professor at Columbia University and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Jeffrey Sachs. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Jeffrey and connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Jeffrey Sachs has argued that diplomatic negotiations are key to ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you think that a negotiated settlement is realistic at this stage, or will the conflict only end through military victory by one side? Sachs has been critical of US and NATO policies toward Russia. Do you believe Western military and economic support for Ukraine has prolonged the war unnecessarily, or is it essential for Ukraine's survival and sovereignty? The war has reshaped global power dynamics with growing cooperation between Russia, China, and other non-Western states. How do you see this conflict influencing the future of international relations, particularly for Europe and the global South? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.